Hello everyone, I have returned with a new rewrite. This time it is the labors of Heracles from Greek mythology. And before you say anything, his actual Greek name is Heracles, not Hercules, that's the Roman name. But anyways, let's get to it. Heracles stepped into the temple of the oracle atop Mt. Parnassus and was met with hushed murmurs and glances. He took a deep breath as walked towards the heart of the chapel, where the oracle was seated. He kneeled before her and, in a voice thick with emotion, began to tell his story. "I pray you hear my plight," he said. "I am Heracles, son of Zeus. Many months ago I was driven to the brink of insanity by Hera. She cursed me with a powerful spell, and in my madness I killed my own family." Heracles' voice broke on the last word. He was overcome with guilt and sorrow, the memories of what he had done weighing heavily on his conscience. The oracle studied him before speaking. "Your suffering will be rewarded," she said, her voice stern. "Go to the city of Tyrants and serve King Eurystheus for 12 long years. If you complete the tasks he sets for you, the gods shall make you immortal." Heracles lifted his head and looked up at the oracle, feeling a spark of hope amidst the darkness he felt. "I will do as you say," he said. The oracle regarded him with a kind smile. "I know this path will be filled with difficulties," she said. "But the reward for your suffering shall be great." Heracles nodded, and with one last look of gratitude, he left the temple and began his journey. Though he did not know what was to come, he was determined to make the most of this second chance and be greater than he ever had been. Heracles arrived triumphantly at the stone castle gates of his cousin, Eurystheus. He had been warned about the temper of the king, so he approached with a measure of caution. Eurystheus himself received him at the gate. He spoke gruffly, "So, Heracles, you have finally arrived. It's been too long since I last saw you. What brings you here, my cousin?" Heracles knew that he had to impress and apologize if he was to win the favor of his powerful cousin. So, he bowed his head and replied humbly, "Your Highness, I have come here to offer you my humble services. I must apologize for all the wrongs I have done in the past and offer up my life as a penance. I am ready to serve you, for 12 years if needed, in order to cleanse myself of my sins." Eurystheus was taken aback by Heracles' offer, but he could see the sincerity in his face and knew that he was a brave and honest man. He nodded grimly and waved his hand. "Very well, my cousin. I accept your service. You shall begin your service tomorrow morning. Now, go and rest, for tomorrow will be a long day." Heracles thanked Eurystheus with a grateful bow and left the castle. He went away knowing that he had made a brave decision. One that would keep him busy for the next 12 years. When Heracles woke up the next morning, King Eurystheus gave him his first task. He must slay the Nemean lion, a powerful beast that lived in the nearby woods. Heracles agreed to face the beast and ventured into the forest bravely, his heart pounding in his chest. Suddenly he saw it, the Nemean lion. It was a majestic creature, but Heracles realized that it could not be slain by any ordinary weapon, but only by his own hands. He readied himself for the fight as the lion charged towards him with a roar. Heracles jumped forward and grabbed the lion around its neck. He wrestled with the beast, holding back its advances with all his strength. The lion fought fiercely and Heracles knew he must keep up the pressure to survive. He locked eyes with the lion and felt a grim determination surge through his veins. After a long, grueling battle, Heracles finally defeated the lion. The defeated lion lay limp in his arms and he looked down and smiled. He had done it. He had killed the Nemean lion. Heracles then took off the lion's skin and draped it around him. As he examined his new attire, he spoke aloud to no one in particular. "Brave was I, strong was I. For I have conquered the beast and now wear his coat and shall be ever watchful for more tasks set by King Eurystheus." And with that, Heracles gathered his courage and ventured forth, wearing the skin of the Nemean lion, ready to face whatever task his king might throw at him next. Heracles had heard the tale of the Lernaean Hydra, a fearsome creature possessing 9 heads. He had readied himself for battle, determined to complete the second task King Eurystheus had set him, to kill this beast. Heracles approached the Hydra and with immense effort, successfully chopped off one of its heads. But 2 new heads grew in its place. Before Heracles knew it, he was being attacked on all sides. He found himself quickly retreating, outnumbered by the Hydra and its multiple heads. Back at his home, Heracles became despondent. How could he ever complete this task? His nephew Iolaus realized what must be done and suggested they return to battle. He explained that while they could never kill all of Hydra's heads, they could burn the neck stumps to stop the regrowth. Heracles heeded his nephew's advice, and the 2 of them marched off to take on the beast. As they neared the Hydra's hideaway, Heracles spoke, "Iolaus, you help me defeat this creature and kill these heads. I will take care of the thing itself." Heracles then set to work. While he made quick work of the Hydra's multiple heads, Iolaus burned the neck stumps to ensure that the beast would stay dead. At first, it seemed that all of the heads had been defeated. But then, Heracles realized that this was not the case. The last head, which had remained silent the entire time, was actually immortal and could not be killed. Heracles realized what he must do. He buried the head under a rock, then he dipped some of his arrows into the Hydra's toxic blood, and returned home to King Eurystheus, victorious in his task, or so he thought. When Heracles reported back to his king, Eurystheus declared that though Heracles had spoken the truth, the task was yet to be completed as he had accepted help. Heracles' victory would not be recognized. Heracles, tired from his journey and feeling defeated, bid his king good night. But in his heart, he knew that he should not be ashamed. For though he had not gotten a chance to prove his strength, he had been brave enough to accept help, and that would stay with him always. Heracles had been on the search for the Cyrenian hind for months, as it was the 3rd task that King Eurystheus had put before him. He had heard of the deer's unparalleled speed, and he feared what would come if he were to fail the task. Nonetheless, he persevered through the mountainous terrains and rugged wilderness, his eyes and ears searching for any sign of the hind. At last, one day he spotted it, lying in a clearing just before the setting sun. He took a deep breath and readied himself for the chase, his muscles tensing as the deer noticed him and burst from the clearing. Desperate, Heracles gave chase, the deer darting between trees and rocks in ways he could barely follow, yet his feet propelled him forward, gaining ground with each second that passed. Finally, after nearly an hour of pursuit, Heracles could feel the deer slowing. As if sensing his presence, the deer came to a sudden stop and Heracles jumped forward, pinning it down with all his might. As he knelt there, exhausted, panting air and with the deer's life in his hands, 2 shimmering figures suddenly appeared before him. He recognized them as Artemis and Apollo, 2 gods more powerful and awe-inspiring than any mere mortal. Heracles humbly bowed before them and, in a wavering voice, said, "Please, have mercy. This task has been put upon me by the king, and the only penance for my recklessness in killing my own family." Artemis looked down on him with a solemn expression and said, "If you can ensure that the deer leaves the king when you return, unharmed, then we will forgive you your transgression." With that, Heracles rose to his feet, picked up the deer, and headed off back to the kingdom. It was a long and difficult journey, but eventually the familiar sight of the king's castle came into view. Heracles arrived at the gates, and the guards quickly opened them for him, leading him to the king's chambers. The king was happy to see Heracles there with the deer, but he had no choice but to accept the task as completed. As he barked out the command to dismiss Heracles, the deer suddenly leapt from his arms, sprinting for the exit. Heracles smiled triumphantly, finally achieving his goal. With this, he bowed and left the castle, knowing without a doubt in his heart that he had earned the forgiveness of the gods. Heracles set off on his fourth task, to capture the Erymanthian boar. On his way, he came across the home of Chiron, the wise centaur. Heracles decided to take a rest and approached Chiron. When they met, Chiron invited Heracles into his home and offered him some wine. Heracles gladly accepted, but the smell of the wine attracted other centaurs. Before they knew it, the home was filled with many of these creatures. As the centaurs rushed in, their rowdy behavior angered Heracles and he immediately drew his bow. He shouted, "I will not stand for such insolence," and released a volley of poison-tipped arrows. The centaurs fled in fear, leaving Heracles and Chiron in peace. However, in the chaos, Heracles had accidentally shot Chiron with his arrows. Chiron moaned in pain and said, "Heracles, why did you do this to me? I would gladly do anything to make this pain disappear. Even take Prometheus's place on his rock. Whatever it takes, I will do it." Heracles was filled with grief and begged Zeus to let Chiron go. Zeus, moved by Heracles' show of loyalty to his friend, agreed and sent an eagle every day to eat out Prometheus's liver and cause him eternal pain. Heracles swore he would rescue Prometheus and rushed off to find the eagle that had been sent by Zeus. After days of searching, he eventually found it and shot the bird with one of his arrows, killing it instantly. With the eagle dead, the cycle of torture was finally broken and Heracles went back to Chiron. Knowing that he had succeeded in his mission, Heracles gave Chiron one last hug and farewell before setting off to finish the fourth task. Heracles had the unenviable task of capturing the monstrous wild boar that had been terrorizing the kingdom. With a bow and arrow, he set out in search of the boar, determined to complete the fourth task given to him by King Eurystheus. After hours of searching the snowy mountain, Heracles finally saw the wild boar, its shimmering black fur almost buried in snow. Heracles' heart raced, but he kept his eyes trained on the beast. Holding his breath, Heracles steady released his arrow with perfect accuracy. The boar collapsed, motionless. Heracles approached cautiously, making sure the boar was indeed dead. Satisfied that the beast was no longer a danger, he managed to lift the boar onto his shoulders and set out on the journey back to King Eurystheus. At the palace, Heracles was greeted by a swarm of servants and citizens. When King Eurystheus emerged, the cheers grew even louder. The king was visibly shocked when he saw Heracles carrying the wild boar. He hastily stumbled back into the palace, shouting, "Heracles has completed his fourth task. Thank the gods. Please dispose of the boar and rest." Heracles shook his head in disbelief. After all that effort, he wasn't going to get a proper thank you. He slowly lowered the boar off of his shoulders and walked towards the entrance. As he stepped inside, the king quickly darted from one of the jars in the hallway and meekly spoke to Heracles. "Ah, Heracles. Once again I must apologize. You've completed your fourth task and I am deeply grateful. I want to thank you personally for your hard work. Please, come in and sit, rest, and accept whatever reward you see fit." Heracles knew that he had been given a raw deal, but he couldn't help but smile. The king had finally accepted his efforts, and he was being recognized. "Thank you," he said. "That means a lot." Now that Heracles had completed his fourth task, he was one step closer to becoming a true hero of the kingdom. King Eurystheus' fifth task for Heracles was to clean the stables of Heracles, ruler of Elis. Before Heracles could begin the task, he had to discuss the terms with King Heracles. Heracles asked the king if he could keep 1/10 of the cattle if he were to clean the stables in a single day. Heracles, knowing the seemingly impossible task, agreed. Heracles got to work immediately. He took his shovel in hand and began to dig. He knew, though, that merely digging would not do the trick. Somehow he must get the water to do the work for him. His divine intelligence, however, was on his side. he diverted the rivers Alpheus and Peneus so that they could flow through the stable, washing out the filth. Heracles worked hard and managed to clean the stables in a single day, but when he asked Augeas to pay the fair reward, Augeas declined, believing Heracles had not done anything worthwhile. Outraged and betrayed, Heracles called on Augeas' son, Phyleus, for support. Together they took Augeas to court to fight for their rights, only to find that Augeas had the support of the court and Heracles and Phyleus were banished from Elis. Enraged by the injustice, Heracles barged into Augeas' palace and killed him. Phyleus was made king and Heracles left Elis, feeling accomplished. When Heracles returned to face terror-stricken Eurystheus, Heracles declared his accomplishment, expecting praise. Instead, Eurystheus decreed that Heracles had not won the task since he had asked for a reward for his feat. "You should have done it with no intention of being rewarded," Eurystheus said sternly. "That is the mark of a true hero." Heracles was disappointed in not receiving credit from Eurystheus, but the mark of a true hero was now branded into his mind. King Eurystheus' sixth task for Heracles was to rid the swamps of the Stymphalian birds, which were owned by Ares. They had made their home in the swamps, and any of the foolish travelers who ventured too deep often never returned. Heracles was prepared for the task, but upon arriving at the swamps, he realized he could not go too deep as he would eventually drown. He was about to turn away when suddenly, Athena appeared in front of him holding a metal rattle in her hand. "Use this," Athena said, "and the birds will scatter from their hiding places." Heracles looked at the rattle and then back to the goddess. "How does it work?" he asked. Athena smiled. "Just shake it and the sound will terrify the birds, making them fly up and away from the swamp. You can then shoot them down with your poisonous arrows." Heracles nodded and took the rattle. He walked to the middle of the swamp and shook the rattle with all his might. Sure enough, the birds flew up from their hiding places in a panic and flew away. Heracles shot his arrows and came surprisingly close to hitting many of the birds. However, most of them flew away to plague other lands, but that's a task for another hero. Athena stood on the edge of the swamp and watched proudly as Heracles completed his task. She said, "Well done, Heracles. Only a few of the birds remain, but your work here is done." Heracles smiled and gave a respectful bow. He was pleased to have been able to succeed in his task. He thanked Athena for her help and then made his way back home, relieved that he had completed King Eurystheus' sixth task. Heracles, recipient of the King Eurystheus' seventh task, carefully plotted his journey to the island of Crete. He needed to capture the Cretan bull, father of the Minotaur, no easy feat. Though his days as a hero of the gods may have hardened him for the task, his heart still raced with nerves as he approached Minos, king of Crete. Heracles had heard many tales of the bull, terrifying stories passed down from generation to generation. So when Heracles asked for permission to take the bull, King Minos hesitated and said, "If the gods can't even control the bull, it is no wonder that you, a mere human, are ill-equipped for such a task." Heracles responded valiantly, claiming, "I am not just a mere human. I am the demigod son of Zeus. I'll prove myself worthy." King Minos was pleased with his grit and ambition, and granted Heracles his greatest challenge yet. Heracles strode toward the bull with only a few supplies. He quickly sized up the creature as a formidable opponent, but he was determined and wouldn't be swayed. With nothing more than his wits and strength, Heracles managed to capture the bull with his bare hands. He sent the animal back to Eurystheus' court, eager to receive his reward. But once the bull arrived at Eurystheus' court, the king broke into a cold sweat. In his cowardice, Eurystheus laid out an offering of a sacrifice to Hera, the goddess. At this, the bull roared and stomped its feet. "No sacrifice is needed for glory to be given to me," it bellowed. Heracles had succeeded in the deed, and the bull wanted to free from its captors. Hera was displeased. "No," she declared. Sacrifice the bull and Heracles will gain yet another notch of glory in his belt. I will not allow it." With that, the bull was left free to go to Marathon, eventually dubbed the Marathonian bull. With a flick of his tail, the bull followed the path of his ancestors, and left Eurystheus' court in peace. The next morning, King Eurystheus told Heracles of his next task, to steal the mares of Diomedes. Heracles began to go to the kingdom of Diomedes. The night was dark and still as Heracles and his men ventured towards Diomedes' kingdom with the goal of stealing the man-eating mares. After weeks of traveling, they finally arrived at their destination. Heracles summoned the courage to scale the walls and confront Diomedes and the army. The fight was a long and arduous one. Ultimately, Heracles emerged victorious, but the cost seemed too high. Abderus, one of Heracles' comrades, had been left in charge of the horses and was now nowhere to be found. "Where is Abderus?" Heracles asked as he surveyed the carnage of the battle. Suddenly, a voice came from behind. "He was devoured by the mares," said a soldier in a defeated tone. Rage and sorrow consumed Heracles as he heard the soldier's revelation. He hunted down Diomedes, and soon, the king was face to face with the angry Heracles. "You will pay for what you have done," Heracles threatened. "Please, I beg your mercy," Diomedes cried. But Heracles would have none of it. Taking his revenge, he fed Diomedes to his own horses, now obedient and calmer than ever. The smell of blood soothed them until they could barely stand. Heracles used this opportunity to bind the horses' mouths shut, and with that, his task was complete. He then founded the city of Abdera in memory of his fallen companion, before bringing the mares back to King Eurystheus. Eurystheus was pleased with Heracles' accomplishment, so pleased in fact, that he sacrificed the horses to Hera as a sign of his gratitude. Heracles may have lost a friend, but he had also proven his strength and courage. The 8th task of Eurystheus was now complete and Heracles was victorious. Heracles and his band of companions set sail for the region of Themyscira, where the Amazons dwelled. The mission was to fulfill King Eurystheus' 9th task, to steal the girdle of Hippolyta. The journey was treacherous and the seas were rough, but they persevered. The gods were on their side, guiding them to their destination. Eventually, they stopped at the island of Paros, where they found themselves in a rather unfortunate situation. Heracles and his companions were met by the sons of King Minos of Crete. Before Heracles and his crew could utter a word, Minos' sons drew their swords and attacked. In an act of self-defense, Heracles and his men fought back, managing to kill 2 of their assailants in the scuffle. As the battle ended, Heracles found himself in an uncharacteristic rage. He turned to Minos' sons and demanded that 2 of the island's inhabitants take the place of his 2 dead comrades and join him in his mission. Minos' grandsons, in an act of bravery and loyalty, enthusiastically accepted. The men said their farewells to the island, and with the newly acquired crew members in tow, Heracles and his companions set sail for Themyscira. After a brief stop at the court of Lycus, a friend of Heracles, they eventually reached the land of the Amazons. Hippolyta was excited to meet Heracles and see the great feat of strength she had heard about. To show her appreciation, she had agreed to hand over her girdle. Heracles asked her to have lunch together on the ship and Hippolyta eagerly followed. As they were aboard, Heracles noticed a storm coming. He wanted to stay and make sure Hippolyta was safe and not caught in the storm, so he asked her if she could spend the night on board. "I would appreciate it, Heracles. It would be better than braving the storm," Hippolyta replied, her eyes flashing with gratitude. Just then, the goddess Hera, in disguise, had been listening in on their conversation. She had been the one to spread the rumor that Heracles was out to abduct their queen. She decided to go to the Amazons and tell them about Heracles' plans. The Amazons, who were distrustful of outsiders, immediately decided to confront Heracles and rowed towards the ship. As Heracles saw them coming, he immediately thought that this had all been set up and Hippolyta no longer had any intention of handing over the girdle. Without any hesitation, he killed her and took the belt. He then set sail back to Tiryns and gave it to King Eurystheus, completing his 9th task. But Heracles was broken by it all. He had never wanted to kill his beloved Hippolyta and was overcome with grief. It was only when he met his fellow Olympians and heard them lamenting with him did he begin to feel better. He vowed to never forget Hippolyta and honor her memory. And so, the land of the Amazons was peaceful again at last, but Hippolyta's fate still lingers in the air. Heracles set off on his 10th task with confidence. After crossing the desert of Libya and dealing with its sweltering heat, he shot an arrow with his bow at the sun and shouted, "You mock me with your warmth. You shall not best me." He heard a voice booming back, "I will not mock you, brave one. I am Helios, the god of the sun. I am so impressed by your courage, let me help you with this task. Hop onto my chariot and I will take you from the west to the island of Erythea, where the cattle of Geryon live." Heracles did as he was told and jumped onto the golden chariot. With a wave of Helios' hand, they began the journey across the sea. Heracles could hardly believe his eyes as he witnessed the sun god's immense power. They moved so quickly, it was as if they were flying. After a few hours, they had already reached the mysterious Erythea. He braced himself as he approached the herd, his gaze fixed on the figure stalking close by. Sure enough, there it was, the two-headed dog Orthrus, just as he thought. Orthrus spotted Heracles and let out a snarling bark, raising his hackles and bracing for attack. Heracles again stood still and strong, wasting no time. In a single swift movement he had club raised and brought down with a mighty crash. It was the last sound Orthrus would ever make as he dropped, instantly slain by the force of the blow. The silence was shattered suddenly by a man's voice, ringing out in panic. Heracles spun to see a herdsman, Eurytushan, standing there, taking in what had happened. Without warning, he advanced on Heracles with a determined anger in his eyes. "You'll pay for that!" Eurytushan shouted out. Heracles stood unflinching, jaw clenched as he waited for the man's next move. He wouldn't have to wait for long, as Eurytushan lunged towards him in a rage. Unfazed, Heracles swung his club again, landing it straight in the man's chest and sending him crashing to the ground. Heracles had no time to relish in his victory, however, as from the corner of his eye he noticed a figure towering towards him, Geryon, the infamous monster he had come to challenge. Geryon roared with anger as he advanced, armed with his 3 shields and 3 spears, wearing 3 helmets to shield him from attack. Heracles gritted his teeth and pulled his bow from his back, firmly planting an arrow on its string. He fired with precision and might, and the arrow flew flying with a roar, piercing Geryon's forehead with unflinching accuracy. The giant's eyes flashed with shock and disbelief, and in a few seconds he had sank to the ground, dead. Heracles, relieved, made his way to seize the legendary cattle, ready for his journey home. Heracles stumbled up the Aventine hill, groaning under the weight of several head of cattle that seemed to draw unwanted attention from nearby beasts. He could feel the judgment of Hera, her displeasure radiating from the skies like an irrepressible storm. At the top of the hill lay an unexpected surprise, a giant. With no time to spare, he had already begun rounding up the cattle of Heracles. Cacus, the giant, had been sent by an enraged Hera to steal the cattle and keep them away from Tiryns, their final resting place. The sight of the giant enraged Heracles, and without both patience and guile, Heracles smashed Cacus with a gargantuan fist. For a brief moment, it seemed all was settled. However, the giant wasn't done yet. He had already made off with several of the cattle and Hera had sent a gadfly to harass and scatter the rest. Yet Heracles, determined not to have his labors declared invalid, would not back down. He retrieved the cows and drove them back to Tiryns, but he wasn't met with an easy journey, With a sudden flourish from Hera, a flood had risen too high to cross. It seemed all hope was lost until one thought came to Heracles. He began stacking large stones one atop the other until there was a bridge capable of supporting the cattle and crossing the river. Both difficult and laborious, he worked until months later the bridge was complete, large enough for him and his cattle to cross the river. As they approached Tiryns, the cattle of Heracles were finally ready to be sacrificed to the goddess. As the cattle were slaughtered, a sense of accomplishment and unparalleled satisfaction washed over Heracles. As it had been done, his 10th labor was complete, or so he thought. Eurystheus declared 2 of the labors invalid, citing that the Hydra could not have been slain by Heracles alone. Second was that payment was received for the cleaning of the Augean stables. He ordered Heracles to complete 2 additional labors, but until that time, Heracles could bask in the glory of his accomplishment of growing out the cattle and then crossing the river with them. Still, as his gaze drifted off to the horizon, Heracles found himself wondering what the next 2 labors could possibly be. Heracles was determined to fulfill King Eurystheus' first extra labor for his penance. He trekked through the ancient lands in search of the golden apples of the Hesperides, guarded by the 100-headed dragon Laden. Along his journey he encountered the formidable half-giant Antaeus, who was believed to be invincible by drawing power from his mother Gaia, as long as his feet touched the ground. Heracles used his wits to defeat Antaeus. He immediately grabbed him and held him high so his feet wouldn't touch the ground, and then proceeded to suffocate him. Heracles was close to achieving his goal. Now, he had to find the Hesperides. He continued on his journey and eventually found them tending their garden in the far western corner of the world. The Hesperides were delighted that Heracles came seeking their golden apples. They asked him why he would want such a precious fruit, to which he replied he had been tasked to get those apples as part of his labor by King Eurystheus. The Hesperides told Heracles of an ancient legend. In order to get to their garden, he must capture the shape-shifting old man of the sea. Heracles was confused, but the nymphs assured him that this deity could show him to the entrance of their garden. Heracles accepted the challenge and set off to find the old man of the sea. After some days of searching, he eventually found him in a cove and using all his strength, managed to capture him. The old man of the sea refused to show Heracles the entrance until he promised to take the old man back to his home, so Heracles agreed. The old man then showed Heracles the way to the garden of Hesperides. After a long and hard trek, he managed to make it to the top of a mountain to see the garden of golden apples. Heracles looked at the garden of the Hesperides, and the 100-headed dragon that guarded it, and sighed in dismay. He had thought the quest would be easy, but it had proved more difficult than anticipated. Suddenly, he came across a figure that he recognized as Atlas, the Titan god who was condemned to hold the heavens on his shoulders. Atlas was also the father of the Hesperides, and thus had access to the garden at any time. Atlas, Heracles called out. I have a proposition for you. If you were to rest for a moment, I can take your place in holding the heavens. Then, you can get the 3 apples from the garden for me and I'll bring them to King Eurystheus. Atlas looked at Heracles skeptically, wondering what benefit he had to get from the deal. After a moment, he agreed to the idea, for he could see the appeal of being able to walk around again, even if it was only for a short while. Heracles took over the sky, while Atlas easily got the apples. When Atlas returned with them, he said that he could bring them to King Eurystheus for Heracles. Heracles immediately remembered that if King Eurystheus knew that he was working with someone else, he would disqualify the challenge. He needed to come up with an excuse to explain how he did it on his own. Atlas, he said. I need to arrange my lionskin cloak for more comfort. I won't be a minute. Could you please hold the sky for me? Atlas agreed, taking back his burden once more, and Heracles walked away, the apples tucked under his arm. He knew his story wouldn't fool anyone, but he was thankful that he had at least tried. King Eurystheus had instructed Heracles to complete his second extra task, to take the three-headed hound Cerberus from the underworld. Heracles had never been to the underworld before, let alone seen the creature he was tasked with taking. But he had been determined to complete this seemingly impossible mission, so he journeyed deep, deep underground. The journey was far darker and more terrifying than Heracles had expected. He wasn't sure what would await him, and he was hesitant to find out. But he pushed forward until he arrived in the underworld, a dark and creepy place. Everywhere he looked, he saw the sights of Hades and the tortured souls lingering in the depths of the underworld. He moved slowly, cautiously, through the underworld, until he arrived in the prison. Here he found the two old heroes he had heard before, Theseus and Pirithous. They were both bound in chains, and Heracles could see that they had been driven nearly mad by their captivity. Heracles had come to this place to do a heroic deed, and he wasn't about to waste any time. He swiftly attacked the chains that bound Theseus and was able to free the hero with ease. But when he turned to Pirithous, the underworld itself seemed to sense the danger of Heracles, and began to rumble with an awful power. Heracles felt the vibration and knew he must not pursue his original plan. He turned to Theseus and said regretfully, "My friend, it seems I can't free you both. I cannot risk the underworld coming down on us, so I must leave Pirithous bound to his chains. I am sorry." Theseus nodded solemnly, understanding the power of the underworld. "Go, Heracles," he said. "Find the monster you were sent to take, and free your own soul from the chains of Eurystheus." Heracles thanked his friend and made his way out of the prison, leaving Theseus behind. With determination, he continued onward, searching for Cerberus, the three-headed hound. After Heracles searched the underworld for 3 days and 3 nights, he found Hades and asked him to let him by through to the entrance with Cerberus in tow. Hades was suspicious and refused to let either of them pass. Heracles didn't give up so easily, and he proposed a deal. He said to Hades that he would not use any weapons to take Cerberus to the surface, as he desired. Hades, being intrigued by the proposal, accepted, and allowed them to pass. Heracles gathered strength and made sure he was ready to try and subdue the three-headed dog without any weapons. He made his way cautiously to the entrance, and that is when Cerberus noticed him. The dog, standing tall and ready to fight, barked and lunged at the large figure of Heracles. He could almost feel its hot breath on his neck as it snapped and growled. Despite this, Heracles fought back, slowly but surely taming the ferocious creature, eventually subduing it with his bare hands. It took him the entire night and a good part of the day, but finally he had Cerberus under his control. He took it by the neck, and threw it over his shoulder, carrying its full weight as he trudged up the steep path. When Heracles returned to Tiryns, the people had heard of the mission and were already waiting. Eurystheus, trembling and quivering in fear, hid in his jar while the citizens of Tiryns watched in shock as Heracles walked the creature down the central street. Heracles rested the dog and looked around, and that is when he saw Eurystheus in his jar. He demanded to know why he had sent him on such an impossible task, and Eurystheus, sensing that he was to be forgiven for his sins, knew better than to argue. He declared Heracles the hero of the day, and forbid him to any more tasks before declaring his sins absolved, and demanded that he return Cerberus to Hades immediately. Heracles gracefully bowed and hauled the beast away. Although it pained him, he released the dog and thanked Hades before turning his attention to his next adventure. It had been a long, hard journey, but his courage and tenacity had finally paid off, and as he strode proudly down the road, a hero praised by all, he knew that he had made his father, Zeus, proud. Heracles and his new wife Deianira had been married for only a few weeks, and they were still happily in love when tragedy struck. For while they were away on their honeymoon vacation, a savage centaur called Nessus had tracked them down and kidnapped the Deianira. Desperate to get his beloved wife back, Heracles and his entourage tracked down Nessus and engaged him in an epic battle. After a long and hard struggle, Heracles emerged victorious, releasing Deianira in the process. But just as Heracles was about to deliver the killing blow, Nessus had the chance to utter one final prophecy. If you truly desire to make Heracles stay in love with you forever, you must use my blood. It has powerful magical properties, he said. Take my bloody shirt and please make sure that Heracles wears it. Deianira obediently followed the instructions of the dying centaur and kept the blood-soaked garment hidden away for the duration of her marriage to Heracles. Years later, when Heracles had fallen in love with a woman named Ino, Deianira wasted no time in taking the blood-soaked garment out of its safe place and giving it to her husband. "Wear this shirt, my love," she said to him. "It will make you love me forever." In a moment of weakness, Heracles put on the shirt, causing himself to become instantly poisoned as Nessus' blood had been tainted with a powerful toxin. In an attempt to stop the pain, he threw himself into a raging fire in which he eventually died, or so everyone thought. When the Olympian gods saw how much love Heracles had for Deianira, they decided to take him up to Mount Olympus and make him a god, ensuring that he and Deianira would remain together for eternity. And so the story of Heracles ended in tragedy but ultimately joy, for his death, though unexpected and horrible, also allowed him to be with his beloved in death, just as he was in life. That was the story. I hope you enjoy. This took a while to make, and I hope it came out good. Almost all the songs will have a link in the description. Like and subscribe for more videos and to be notified of these new videos when they come out, and I'll see you in the next video. Cue the outro.